The security guard handed me a pink suspension notice while my 10-year-old son was still holding a dripping pool noodle. My daughter read the words over my shoulder and asked why we were being punished for trying to have a Saturday. And across the deck, Gordon Vale lifted a plastic cup toward his buddies, while their grandchildren cannonballed into the deep end with a portable radio playing Jimmy Buffett by the snack bar. That was the summer of 1995, in Cedar Run Estates outside Dayton, Ohio. And until that afternoon, I had thought the worst thing a person could lose was a husband, because I had lost mine 4 years earlier and survived it somehow, one long day at a time, with a coffee pot that never quit, and 2 kids who needed school lunches whether I felt like getting out of bed or not. But standing there by that pool gate, holding a notice that banned my family from the only place my children had looked forward to all summer, I learned something else. You can lose your peace long before you lose your home. My name is Lena Hart. I was 46 that year. I ran a small electrical business my father had started out of a cinder block shop on Route 48. And I had a 15-year-old daughter named Sophie and a 10-year-old son named Eli. We had moved into Cedar Run because it was supposed to be our fresh start. The brochure showed kids racing through sprinklers, neighbors grilling in cul-de-sacs, couples drinking lemonade under big maple trees, and a big, clean community pool with a diving board that looked about as glamorous to us as a country club. The homeowners association fee was $180 a month, which felt like a small fortune to me back then, but I told myself it was worth it. Sophie had been quiet since her dad died. Quiet in that way teenagers get when they are carrying 100 thoughts they do not want their mother to hear. And Eli had just started growing into his limbs, all knees and elbows and grass stains. I thought a place like Cedar Run could give them a little bit of ordinary. I thought ordinary was enough. At first it was. The old association president was a man named Frank Rudd, a retired high school principal who wore white sneakers with every outfit and kept peppermints in his shirt pocket. Frank believed a neighborhood was supposed to sound alive. He would stand by the shallow end in a sun visor, pretending to scold the kids for splashing, then grin when they splashed him right back. Sophie joined the swim team. Eli learned to float without plugging his nose, and for one whole summer I got to sit under a faded umbrella with other mothers and fathers, holding a paperback book open on my lap, while my children laughed loud enough to make me forget what I was reading. Then Frank had a stroke in the fall of 1994 and stepped down, and that was when Gordon Vale found his way into the picture. Gordon was 61, recently retired from a regional auto parts company, always dressed like he had an appointment with a banker even when he was taking out the trash. He had silver hair combed straight back, a heavy gold watch, and a way of looking at people that made you feel like he was estimating the cost of fixing whatever was wrong with you. He ran for association president on a platform called Restoring Standards. Now, that phrase sounds harmless if you see it printed in black ink on a newsletter, but in Cedar Run, Restoring Standards meant Gordon wanted the neighborhood to look quiet enough for a real estate brochure and stiff enough for his friends from the country club. He said the pools had become unruly, the kids were too loud, the parents were careless, that property values were at risk. The funny thing was, nobody had ever complained about the pool before Gordon came along, except maybe when somebody forgot to refill the paper cups by the water fountain. Still, people voted for him because he sounded organized, and older folks liked that he had a binder for everything. Gordon loved binders. He carried one under his arm like a preacher carries a Bible. I had my first run-in with him in March, before pool season even started. The association had hired a company to replace some of the lights around the tennis courts, and Gordon came into my shop asking if I could sign off on the electrical work. I looked at the quote and nearly choked on my coffee. The contractor was charging almost double what the job should have cost. When I asked who owned the company, Gordon smiled without showing teeth and said, "My nephew has been trying to get his business off the ground." I told him I wished the nephew well, but the numbers were crooked. Gordon leaned over my counter and said, "Lena, not everything needs to become a public debate." I told him, "Neither does every bad invoice, but here we are." I did not know it then, but that was the moment he decided I was a problem. By Memorial Day, he had installed new rules all over the pool deck. No floating devices between noon and 4. No games in the water. No music. No jumping unless you were using the diving board, and even then only one person at a time with a full 10-second pause between dives, as if the children were boarding an airplane. There were adult quiet hours from 1 to 3 every afternoon, right when the kids came home from camp or baseball practice. The worst part was the swooning test. Any child under 16 had to pass a test before using the deep end, and Gordon insisted on supervising it himself even though he had never been a lifeguard, never taught a swimming lesson, and looked nervous whenever water came close to his loafers. Sophie passed because she'd been swimming since she was 6. Eli passed too, though Gordon made him tread water until his arms shook. When I asked if that was really necessary for a 10-year-old, Gordon said, "Rules are not supposed to be comfortable, Mrs. Hart." I remember looking at him and thinking, "You're not talking about safety, are you? You were talking about obedience." I tried to let it go. I really did. I was tired. I had work crews depending on me, bills stacked on the kitchen counter, and grief still sneaking up on me in places it had no business being. Like the grocery store when I saw Jack's favorite cereal, or the hardware aisle when I smelled sawdust. I did not want another battle, but Gordon kept handing us one. One afternoon, Eli brought a foam noodle into the pool during what Gordon called the restricted recreation window. The noodle did not hurt anybody. It barely made a ripple. Gordon blew a whistle so hard 3 people jumped out of their lawn chairs. He walked over and said, "That is your first written warning." Eli stood there, looking at the noodle like it had betrayed him. Another time, Sophie stayed in the water 5 minutes after the swim team lane closed because a younger girl had panicked during practice. Sophie stayed with her until the lifeguard got over there, and 2 days later I got a $50 fine in the mail for unauthorized use of the competition lanes. I took the notice to the association office and found Gordon sitting behind a folding table with his binder open. I said, "My daughter helped a scared child." Gordon said, "Your daughter broke a rule." I said, "You are really going to fine a 15-year-old for doing the decent thing?" He looked down at the paper and said, "Decency does not excuse non-compliance." That was the kind of thing Gordon said. He had a talent for making simple human moments sound like paperwork. By the middle of June, people were whispering about him. A nurse named Diane McCall told me her grandson had been told to stop laughing because he was making the elderly residents uncomfortable. A single dad named Leon Givens said his daughter had been sent home for wearing a bright pink inflatable ring during the wrong hour. Mrs. Bright, Vera Perez, who was the association secretary and had lived in Cedar Run since the beginning, told me quietly that Gordon had become impossible to reason with. She said, "That man thinks a neighborhood is a showroom, Lena. He forgets people have to live in it." So I started asking questions. I made copies of the rules, called a few parents, and spent one Tuesday night at my dining room table with a legal pad, a half-eaten bag of pretzels, and a rotary phone that kept ringing because word had spread. By the end of the week, I had signatures from 23 households asking the board to reconsider the pool rules. I was not trying to start a revolution. I just wanted the kids to be able to splash without needing a permit. The board meeting was held in the clubhouse on a humid Thursday night, and the room smelled like coffee, wet wool, and those lemon cookies people bring when they do not know what else to do. Gordon sat at the front with 2 other board members, his binder opened in front of him like he expected to perform surgery. I stood up, hands sweating around the petition, and said, "We all pay the same dues. Families with children should not be treated like they are visitors in their own neighborhood. The pool belongs to all of us." Gordon did not even look embarrassed. He flipped through the signatures, tapped the stack neatly on the table and said, "Mrs. Hart, shared spaces require discipline. If your family needs a more relaxed environment, perhaps you should consider creating one at home." A few people laughed, mostly Gordon's golf buddies and a couple of older residents who had decided children were the greatest inconvenience ever invented. I felt my face get hot, but I did not give him the satisfaction of seeing it. I just said, "You know what, Gordon? That might be the first useful thing you have said all year." The final vote went against us, 3-2. I walked out of that clubhouse with Sophie beside me and Eli holding my hand. My son looked up and asked, "Mom, why does Mr. Vale hate kids?" I told him he did not hate kids. I said he just did not remember being one. That sounded wiser than the truth. The truth was, I thought Gordon hated anything he could not control. The final straw came 2 days later. It was 93 degrees, the kind of Ohio heat that makes the sidewalks look soft. Ellie had been begging to go to the pool all morning, and Sophie had invited a friend from school. I packed towels, sunscreen, peanut butter crackers, and that old blue cooler Jack and I had bought at the garage sale during our first year of marriage. We walked down to the pool, and I remember thinking maybe we could get through one afternoon without trouble. We had barely set down our things when Gordon appeared with the teenage guard, a decent kid named Dale who looked like he wanted to disappear through the concrete. Gordon held out a pink sheet of paper and said, "Lena, I am afraid your family's pool privileges are suspended for the remainder of the season." I laughed once because I honestly thought he was joking. Then I read the paper. It listed 3 offenses: Eli's pool noodle, Sophie's 5 extra minutes helping a frightened swimmer, a complaint about excessive noise during a family recreation hour. I looked up and said, "You are banning my children from the pool for this." Gordon folded his hands. "Repeated violations require consequences." I said, "Your buddies are over there with rafts, beach balls, a radio, and enough beer in that cooler to start a float parade." He did not turn around. He just said, "They have permission." That was when I understood the whole thing. The rules were never the point. The rules were just the fence Gordon used to decide who belonged on which side. Eli's eyes filled up first. He tried to hide it because he was 10 and 10-year-old boys are taught too early that tears are something to apologize for. Sophie stood perfectly still the way she had stood at her father's funeral, and I hated Gordon for making her look like that again. I did not yell. I did not make a scene. I gathered our towels, took my kids by the hand, and walked home with that pink notice folded into my pocket like a matchbook. At the corner I looked back. Gordon's friends were dragging giant vinyl floats through the gate. Their grandchildren were screaming and splashing, and that old Jimmy Buffett song drifted over the fence, cheerful as sin. Something inside me went quiet. Not calm, quiet, like the second before a storm takes down a power line. Part 2. The place he could not control. That night, after the kids went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with the pool notice in front of me and a glass of iced tea sweating beside it. The house was still except for the ticking clock above the stove and the soft rattle of the window air conditioner. I kept reading the words unsafe conduct, repeated violations, suspension of privileges, and every time I read them I got angrier in a different way. At first I was angry for Sophie, then for Eli, then for every parent who had been made to feel like their children were a nuisance for being children. But around midnight, the anger changed shape. It started to feel useful. I got out the metal file box, where I kept old closing papers and tax records, the one that had belonged to Jack before he died. I had not opened it in months. There were old utility bills, maps, receipts, a Polaroid of Jack standing in front of our first truck with a wrench in his hand and a look on his face like he had just solved every problem in the world. Underneath all that was the original survey for our house. I spread it across the table and stared at it until my eyes hurt. Our lot looked ordinary enough until I noticed a narrow strip of land behind the back fence marked Parcel 17B, former Orchard Service Tract. I remember the realtor mentioning something about it when we bought the house. She had said it was included in the deed, but not part of the association common plan, something left over from the farm that had been divided up to build Cedar Run. At the time, I nodded like I understood. That night, I understood enough to pick up the phone. The next morning, I called the Montgomery County Planning Office and asked for a man named Harold Baines, because Harold had worked with my father years ago on a warehouse job. He was not a friend exactly, but he was the kind of county employee who still believed in helping people if they came prepared with the right paperwork and did not act like they were doing him a favor by showing up. I drove downtown with a thermos of coffee and the survey folded in my purse. Harold wore a green visor, had a cigar tucked behind one ear, and kept 3 stacks of files on his desk that looked like they had been growing there since the Nixon administration. He studied the map for a few minutes, then looked at me over his glasses. "Well, Lena," he said, "this little strip behind your house is not in the homeowners association. Never was. It is a separate parcel, zoned residential recreation under an old county designation." I said, "What does that mean in plain English?" He smiled. "It means the association can complain all day long, but they cannot tell you what to do with it as long as you follow county code." I asked him what I could build. He told me I could put in a fenced swimming pond, a small pool, a play area, probably a covered pavilion, maybe even a little water feature if the permits checked out. I sat there for a second, then I started laughing so hard Harold thought something was wrong with me. I said, "Gordon Vale told me to create a more relaxed environment at home." Harold said, "Sounds like he gave you permission." I drove back to Cedar Run with the windows down, a cassette tape playing on the truck radio, the hot Ohio wind blowing my hair everywhere, and for the first time in weeks I could breathe. I did not know exactly what I was going to build. I only knew I was going to build something. That evening, I told Sophie and Eli. I laid the survey across the table and said, "You remember how Mr. Goldovicoris Vale said maybe we should make our own place to swim?" Eli frowned and said, "Are we moving?" Sophie looked at me and said, "Mom, what are you doing?" I pointed to the strip of land behind the fence. I said, "I think I am going to turn that old backlot into a swimming place of our own. Sophie blinked twice, then she smiled in a way I had not seen since before her dad got sick. Ely stood up so fast his chair fell over. He said, "With a slide." I said, "Maybe a slide." He said, "And a waterfall." I said, "You are negotiating from a weak position, buddy." He said, "A waterfall is not a weak position." By breakfast the next morning we had named it Bluebird Basin because there was an old bluebird house nailed crookedly to one of the orchard trees. It had probably been there 20 years, maybe longer. The name stuck because it sounded like something people could belong to without needing Gordon Vale's permission. I took 2 days off work, which I could barely afford, and I started planning. I called my old friend Max Dobbs, who ran a small excavation company and had once helped my father dig a trench through frozen ground on Christmas Eve. I called a concrete supplier in Kettering that owed me a favor after I had saved their office from a wiring fire. I called a plumber named Roscoe Hall, who had a laugh like an old pickup trying to start and a heart bigger than most churches. I did not want a fancy resort. I wanted a safe, solid place where children could swim, parents could sit, and nobody would be told to lower their voice because someone else had decided joy was a nuisance. We planned a shallow pool with a gradual stone entry, a simple 12-foot slide that curved into the deep end, a little splash area for younger kids, a rock waterfall built from local fieldstone, and a broad deck with shade sails that could come down in a storm. I overbuilt the fence, installed extra drains, and made sure every permit was stamped, filed, copied, and stored in a manila folder thick enough to make Gordon jealous. I did not do it because I was afraid of him. I did it because I had spent my whole life in construction and electrical work, and I knew one thing for sure. People like Gordon do not come after the part of your work that is weak. They come after the part they hope you forgot. Word got around fast. Cedar Run had no social media in 1995, no group chats, no neighborhood apps, but it did have front porches, kitchen phones, and women who could spread information faster than a radio station. By the third day, people were walking past my house just to see the excavator digging behind the fence. Kids rode their bikes slow enough to fall over. Leon Givens showed up with a 6-pack of root beer and asked if I needed help moving gravel. Diane McCall brought sandwiches for the crew. Vera Perez came by after dark, when she knew Gordon would not be driving his golf cart around, and she stood near the gate with her arms folded. She said, "I have wanted to do something like this for months." I said, "You could have." She looked sad when she answered, "I know. I just did not know how to start." That stayed with me. Sometimes people do not need a leader. They need somebody willing to be the first person standing in the rain. Gordon came to my yard on the 5th day, of course he did. He arrived with 2 board members and a clipboard, wearing tan slacks so pressed they looked painful. The excavator was running, the crew was moving dirt, and Eli was sitting on the back steps with a lemonade in one hand and a construction helmet Max had given him in the other. Gordon stopped at the sidewalk and said, "Mrs. Hart, this construction has not been approved by the Architectural Review Committee." I wiped my hands on my jeans and said, "That must be frustrating for the Architectural Review Committee." He stared at me. I handed him the county permits, the zoning letter, and the parcel survey. He flipped through them, faster at first, then slower. I could see the moment he understood. His jaw tightened. He said, "This is an obvious attempt to undermine the association." I said, "No, Gordon, this is a swimming pool. You are the one turning it into a war." He stepped closer to the gate. "You are encouraging division in this neighborhood." I said, "No, I am giving people a place to cool off in July. The division started when you decided some children were allowed to laugh and others were not." For a second, I thought he might come through the gate. Then Roscoe stood up from the pipe trench, all 6 feet 4 of him, holding a wrench the size of a small dog. Roscoe did not say anything. He just looked at Gordon. Gordon folded the permits, shoved them back into my hands and said, "This is not over." I smiled and said, "You keep saying that like it is a threat." A week later, the first cease and desist letter arrived by certified mail. It claimed Bluebird Basin violated community harmony standards. I took it to a lawyer named Russell Bell, who had a small office above a travel agency and a desk so cluttered it looked like paper had evolved there naturally. Russell read the letter, leaned back and said, "Mr. Vale seems to believe the association owns the sun, the air, and every inch of Ohio." I said, "Can he stop me?" Russell said, "Not on that parcel. Not if you keep doing exactly what you were doing." So I kept doing exactly what I was doing. We poured concrete, installed the pump system, tested the water twice, put up the fence, and built a changing shed out of cedar planks that smelled so good it made me think of camping trips from when I was little. Sophie painted a bluebird on the door with a tiny yellow sun behind it. Eli insisted on painting a sign that said, "No ground, UPS a load, unless they bring snacks." I let him keep it. The closer we got to finishing, the worse Gordon behaved. He started sending board volunteers to stand on the sidewalk and take notes whenever people came to help. He had a woman named Marjorie Klein walk past my house twice a day with a disposable camera, snapping pictures of the construction like she was documenting a crime scene. One Tuesday morning, a county health inspector showed up in a white sedan. I will admit, my stomach dropped when I saw him. Gordon had finally found a way to make me nervous. The inspector introduced himself, shook my hand, and spent 2 hours checking the drains, the pump system, the chlorine levels, the fence latch, the slope around the pool, everything. I followed him around with my heart beating in my throat. Finally, he closed his clipboard and said, "Mrs. Hart, I have seen public pools with fewer safeguards than this. Whatever you are building it right." Across the street, Gordon was standing on his porch pretending to water a plant that had probably not needed water since April. The inspector handed me the report, and I looked straight at Gordon and waved it over my head. He did not wave back. That Friday, just after sunset, we filled the pool. Max set the last stone into the waterfall wall. Roscoe started the pump, and for a few seconds nothing happened. Then the water began to spill over the rocks, slow at first, then steady, cool and silver in the work lights. Eli let out a yell so loud every dog on the block started barking. Sophie grabbed my hand and said, "Dad would have loved this." I did not answer right away. I watched the water move over the stone, listened to the soft hum of the pump, and felt something in my chest loosen. Then I said, "Yeah, honey, he would have." Part 3. What a Nate would have. Part 3. What a Nate would have is for. We opened Bluebird Basin the next Saturday, and I expected maybe 6 or 7 families to come by. I had made simple flyers on the copy machine at my shop, blue paper with a little bird stamped in the corner, and Sophie had helped deliver them after dinner. They said Blue Bar, Blue Basin Summer Day. Families, welcome me. Bring a towel, bring a snack, bring your liar. Bah! Almost did not include that last part, but Sophie said it was the best line, so we kept it. By noon, cars were parked halfway down the street. Leon brought a grill. Diane brought macaroni salad. Vera brought a stack of liability waivers Rustler typed up and copied at the office supply store. Children came through the gate carrying goggles, flip-flops, beach towels, stuffed animals, and enough excitement to power a small city. Ellie stood at the check-in table wearing his construction helmet and handing out hand-drawn membership cards that said Bruibiaran BART Basin Club in blue marker. Sophie ran the music from a boombox near the changing shed and played old tapes she had borrowed from a friend, Tom Petty, Fleetwood Mac, a little Sheryl Crow. It was not fancy. There were folding chairs, paper plates, a cooler full of lemonade, and a plastic table somebody had dragged over from their garage. But the minute those kids hit the water, the whole place came alive. They ran through the splash area, slid down the curve into the pool, climbed over the rocks near the waterfall, and laughed so hard I could hear it from the kitchen. Parents sat in the shade and talked the way people do when they have finally stopped being careful around each other. They talked about jobs, school, divorce, bad knees, car trouble, recipes, and the strange things their children said in the back seat. For the first time since Jack died, I did not feel like the woman people checked on. I felt like part of something. Across the street, the Cedar Run pool was nearly empty. Gordon sat under an umbrella with 2 of his friends, all 3 of them pretending they were not looking over at us. I saw him lift his drink, then lower it slowly when another family walked through my gate instead of his. I should tell you, I did not ban Gordon from Bluebird Basin that first day. I did not need to. He would not have come. Men like Gordon do not walk into places where they are no longer in charge. But 2 weeks later, he tried. It was a Sunday afternoon. The pool was full. Kids were playing Marco Polo. Roscoe was asleep in a lawn chair with a newspaper over his face. And I was at the check-in table when Gordon walked up wearing dark sunglasses and a white polo shirt. He slid a waiver toward me and said, "I would like to join." I looked at the paper, then at him. He said, "As a resident of Cedar Run, I have every right to use a recreational facility in this neighborhood." I said, "This is not a neighborhood facility, Gordon. It is a private recreation group on private land." He smiled that thin smile again. "And you are excluding me." I said, no, I am excluding active association officers while there is an ongoing conflict involving the association. Russell had helped us write the club rules after the first letter from Gordon. The rules were clear. No dues, no commercial business, no public admission, and no active board officer who had used official authority to harass club members could take part until the conflict was resolved. It was not about revenge. At least, that is what I told myself. It was about keeping the place safe. Gordon leaned closer and said, "You have become exactly what you accuse me of being." I looked past him at the pool, at Sophie sitting with a younger girl who was nervous about going down the slide, at Eli laughing so hard he nearly fell off the deck chair, at Diane and Vera sharing a plate of cookies. Then I said, "No, Gordon. The difference is I am not taking anything away from your children. You just do not like that people found a way to live without your permission." His face changed then. Not anger exactly. Something tighter. Something like panic. He took the waiver, crumpled it in his fist, and walked away. After that, he tried everything. He sent fines for excessive noise. Russell answered with a letter so sharp I could practically hear it cutting paper. Gordon proposed a new association rule banning moving water features visible from common areas. That vote failed because by then half the neighborhood had been to Bluebird Basin and the other half had heard about the burgers. He reported us to the county as an unlicensed commercial water park. The same inspector came back, saw no cash register, no ticket booth, no admission fee, just a bunch of families eating hot dogs under shade sails, and told me, "Mrs. Hart, I wish this was what people called me out for every week." Gordon's real mistake came through Vera Perez. Vera had been keeping the association minutes for years, and while Gordon thought she was harmless because she was soft-spoken, he had forgotten that quiet people are often the ones who notice everything. One evening, she knocked on my door holding a brown accordion folder. She looked pale. I invited her in, made coffee, and she sat at my kitchen table, turning her wedding ring around and around on her finger. Finally, she said, "I should have brought this to you sooner." Inside the folder were carbon copies of reservation forms, handwritten notes, deposit slips, and a roster titled Preferred Residents. The preferred residents were Gordon's friends, his golf partners, 2 board members, Marjorie Klein, and a handful of people who had never received fines no matter how many rules they broke. The reservation forms were worse. Gordon had been renting out the community pool on weekends for private parties, charging local companies cash deposits, then listing the closures in the neighborhood bulletin as pump maintenance. Meanwhile, families like mine had been told the pool was too expensive to operate and too dangerous to use freely. I sat there looking at those copies, listening to the refrigerator hum, and I felt sick. I had thought Gordon was petty. I had thought he was controlling. But he had been using the pool like it belonged to him, and using the rules to protect the people he liked while squeezing everyone else. Vera started crying. She said my husband helped build that pool when this neighborhood was new. We laid the first tile together. I did not know how to stop him. I reached across the table and took her hand. I said, "You just did." The next board meeting was the biggest Cedar Run had ever seen. People came early and stood in the hall because there were not enough chairs. Leon brought a box of copies. Diane handed them out. Sophie stayed home with Eli, but before I left she said, "Do not let him talk around it, Mum." She knew Gordon's trick. He could turn any question into a lecture about procedure until people forgot what they had come to ask. Not that night. I stood at the front of the room with the deposit slips in my hand and said, "Gordon Vale has told this community that strict rules were necessary for safety, fairness, and property values. Meanwhile, he was secretly allowing his friends to break those rules, renting the pool for private events, and telling families the facility was closed for maintenance when it was being used for profit." Gordon jumped to his feet. That is a gross misrepresentation. I held up the reservation forms, then explained these. He started talking about administrative discretion, temporary arrangements, special circumstances. The room turned on him fast. A man from the back shouted, "My daughter got fined for a beach ball while you were renting out the pool to insurance salesmen." An older woman stood up and said, "My grandson was sent home for laughing. You told me that was for safety." Even Marjorie Klein looked uncomfortable. Gordon slammed his binder shut so hard the sound cracked through the room. He pointed at me and said, "You have poisoned this community." I said, "No, Gordon. I just stopped pretending the water was clean." That was the night his power started to break. But it did not end there, because people who have spent years controlling others do not walk away when they lose one argument. Gordon filed a lawsuit against me and the Bluebird Basin Club, claiming we were operating a discriminatory facility and interfering with association harmony. Russell read the papers, sighed and said, "This is not about winning. This is about making your life expensive." He was right. Lawsuits are a kind of weather. They hang over you even when it is sunny. Every time the phone rang, I wondered what new bill or new threat it would be. I started sleeping badly. I lost weight. At work, I snapped at my crew over things that did not matter. One night, Sophie found me sitting in the garage staring at a box of invoices. She said, "Mum, maybe we should stop." I looked at her and said, "Do you want to stop?" She shook her head. Then she said something I will never forget. She said, "I do not think you are fighting for the pool anymore. I think you are fighting because nobody stopped him when he started." That was exactly it. Gordon had lasted as long as he did because every person he pushed aside told themselves it was easier not to make a fuss. I had done the same thing at first. I had paid the $50. I had packed up the towels. I had told my children to be patient. There is a time for patience, but there is also a time when patience becomes permission. The turning point came during a July thunderstorm. It was one of those Midwest storms that roll in black and green, with lightning hitting close enough to make the house shake. The rain came down so hard it flooded the streets, knocked branches onto cars, and filled the Cedar Run pool deck with muddy water. By morning, the association pool was a mess. The old drainage system had failed, the pump room had flooded, and the main circulation motor had burned out. Gordon called an emergency meeting, but the association reserve fund was low because he had been spending money on legal fees and private repairs. Nobody had approved. The estimate to fix the pool was more than the board could cover without raising dues. People were furious. Then Leon came to my house with Diane and Vera. They stood on my porch, soaked from the rain. Leon said, "Lena, we need you." I laughed once, not because it was funny, but because the same people who had watched Gordon ban my kids were now asking me to save his pool. I said, "You want me to repair the place that kicked my family out?" Vera looked me in the eye and said, "Not for Gordon, for the neighborhood." I looked through the window toward Bluebird Basin. The water was calm under the gray sky. Eli and Sophie were inside watching cartoons, and for a minute I wanted to say no. I wanted to let Gordon sit with the consequences of everything he had done. I wanted to let that pool turn green and empty, so every person in Cedar Run could see what his kind of leadership built. Then I heard Jack's voice in my head, not really his voice, but the memory of him, telling me the same thing he used to say when a customer called late at night with a furnace out in January. Fix what you can. Do not become the problem you are trying to solve. So I grabbed my tool bag. The repair took 3 days. My crew volunteered after work. Roscoe found a replacement motor through a supplier in Springfield. Leon and half a dozen teenagers cleared debris from the deck. Diane organized food. Vera made phone calls from the clubhouse landline. We worked in mud, heat, and mosquito clouds. Gordon showed up the second day and said, "Mrs. Meir, Hart has no authorization to tamper with association property." I was waist deep in the pump room with a flashlight between my teeth. I pulled it out and said, "Then you are welcome to climb down here and fix it yourself." He looked at the black water around my boots, then at his loafers. He left. On the third evening, the new pump came alive. The water began to circulate, slow at first, then faster, pulling leaves and dirt toward the drains. A cheer went up from the deck. Kids who had been watching from behind the fence started clapping. I stood there wet, filthy, exhausted, and happier than I had been in years. Not because I had beaten Gordon, not even because I had fixed the pool. I was happy because for the first time, Cedar Run had stopped waiting for somebody in a binder to tell us what our community was worth. The special election happened in August. Turnout was the highest the association had ever seen. People who had never attended a board meeting showed up in line with folding chairs, thermoses, and newspapers tucked under their arms. Gordon tried to run again. He gave a speech about standard stability and resisting emotional decisions. Nobody interrupted him. That was the strangest part. The room just listened. Then Leon stood up and said, "We have had enough standards. What we need is neighbors." The vote was not close. Gordon and 2 board members were removed. Vera became treasurer. Leon became president. Diane took over recreation and amenities. They asked me to join the board, and I said no. I told them, "I will help you fix things, but I've spent enough time in meetings. Put me where the wires are." So that is what I did. We repaired the association pool properly, brought back family swim hours, allowed noodles and beach balls, put in shaded benches. and built a small splash feature near the shallow end with leftover materials from Bluebird Basin. Sophie helped paint a new sign that said, "See da run poo. All families welcome." Eli asked if we could add "no ground UPS, a load unless they bring slacks." We said no, but only because the association committee had finally learned what rules were supposed to be for. Gordon stayed in Cedar Run for another month. I saw him a few times, walking alone near the clubhouse, his gold watch flashing in the sun, his binder gone. One evening in late September, after the Bluebird Basin had been drained for the season, I found him standing near the back fence. The Bluebird house was crooked in the same old tree, and the water was still enough to reflect the first yellow leaves. For a while, neither of us said anything. Then Gordon said, "You really think you won something?" I thought about it. I could have said 100 sharp things. I could have reminded him about the pink notice, about Eli crying, about Sophie standing silent at that pool gate. I could have made him feel small. Instead, I said, "I do not think this was ever supposed to be about winning." He looked at me and said, "You turned the neighborhood into a circus." I said, "No, Gordon, we turned it into a neighborhood." He stood there another moment, then nodded once, almost like it hurt him, and walked away. A week later, there was a for sale sign in his front yard. I heard he moved to a retirement community in Florida, where the pools were quiet and the rules were probably printed in gold letters. Maybe he was happier there. I do not know. What I do know is that Bluebird Basin stayed open every summer after that. Families rotated bringing food. Kids got older, then some of them brought younger siblings. Then one day Sophie came home from college and stood by the waterfall with a little girl from next door on her hip. Eli grew tall enough to complain about his back, which is nature's little joke on all of us. The association pool stayed busy too. There were still arguments because every neighborhood has arguments. People fought about mulch colors, parking, basketball hoops, Christmas lights, and whether someone named their dog something too fancy. But the big thing changed. People showed up. They asked questions. They stopped treating meetings like somebody else's problem. And sometimes, late in the afternoon, when the sun was low and the kids were still laughing in the water, I would sit by the old Bluebird house and think about that day. Gordon handed me the suspension notice. He thought he was taking something away from us. He did for a little while, but he also pushed us into building something we never would have imagined. That is the part I still think about. Was I right to keep Gordon out of Bluebird Basin while he was still on the board? Or did I become a little too much like the man I was fighting? Was it justice, or was it just a better-looking kind of gatekeeping? I have my answer, but I know not everybody will agree. So tell me what you think. If someone had humiliated your family, played favorites, and used a community space like it belonged to them, would you have done what I did? Would you have built something better, or would you have let them keep the power? Leave your honest opinion in the comments, because sometimes the line between standing up for yourself and becoming what hurts you is thinner than any of us want to admit.